mass sightings. There have been a number of mass sightings. Phoenix Lights, of course, is one of the major ones. I happen to have not been in Phoenix at that time in March, so I kind of missed it, but it was a dramatic event. Dr. Lynn Katai, who's a medical doctor, that picture that's on the cover of her book, those three orbs, she actually saw, I think, about a year or several months before the event, and they came right up to her balcony. She overlooked Phoenix for where she lived. Came right up to her balcony. She said it was weird. It's like they did a mind meld or something. So when the incident actually occurred, she was obviously very interested in it, and she spent quite a number, actually several years, investigating this phenomena. Now, she didn't want to come out of the closet right away until she had completed an investigation, but finally she did, and she did a really good job. I mean, if you get a chance to get her book or her video, it's well done, well researched, and she did a good job of documenting that event. Supposedly it was, some people say that it was like a triangular aircraft, maybe a mile in dimension, and apparently it had been tracked coming down from Nevada all the way down, of course, through Phoenix airspace into Tucson and then Sonora and then back. It violated Phoenix international airspace. So for that reason, there's been some government investigation. Anyway, the government story was, well, that was just flares. But that's been proven to be not true. It wasn't flares. At that time, Fife Symington was the governor, and he was being deluged by calls because thousands of people saw this thing, the actual craft, and they wanted to know what it was. So anyway, it was almost like they'd reached a state of panic. So what he did is he had a press conference, and he had one of his staff members come on stage with an alien costume, saying, "Well, here's the guy that did it," you know. And he was doing that primarily to kind of lighten the issue, because he knew better. And here's what his press conference, and that was broadcast. I was at the time, I think, in Connecticut, and that was broadcast all the way out to Connecticut, which is way out there. But anyway, now he's not governor, and he's come out of the closet, and he's on the circuit, so to speak. And here he is speaking at the National Press Club about his experience, where he said he'd seen this thing. He was at home, I think, originally. Anyway, he looked up and he saw this thing. Now, he's a pilot. I didn't know that at the time, but he was in the Air Force. And so he knew it wasn't something we had. Then in 2006, another mass sighting. This occurred at the O'Hare Airport. It was 4:30 in the afternoon or evening in November, so it was starting to get, the light was starting to fade. But anyway, there was this metallic-looking object hovering over gate C-17 for several minutes. A lot of people saw it, and you know, I guess we're dazzled by it maybe. But anyway, all of a sudden it shot straight up through the clouds, punched a hole all the way up. And well, they reported this, but the FAA refused to investigate it. They said it was a weather phenomenon. Well, they could be right in one sense. It is possible under certain weather conditions, if ice forms at a higher cloud deck, let's say, and then starts collapsing, it could punch a hole through the lower decks of clouds. But in this case, the hole was from the bottom up, so that was hard to explain. Stephenville, Texas was another major one, January 8th, 2008. Stephenville was not too far from the presidential ranch at that time, so you weren't supposed to fly around there, but yet this thing didn't seem to know that. Steve Allen, not the actor, but the pilot, described the object to be a mile long and half a mile wide. He said that it was flying along to be about 3,000 feet above the ground, traveling maybe 3,000 miles an hour. And then later on it came back again, being chased by some F-16s. So days later, because the local base was contacted asking, what is this? And they didn't have an answer for a while, and then days later, the cover story was, well, that was a flight of 10 F-16s that everybody saw. So when did this truth embargo start? Because it's certainly present today. And my opinion is that it started back in 1952. And there was a major event that occurred in Washington, D.C. You can see a picture here of these, probably Foo Fighters, over Washington. And for 6 hours, it kind of got our military kind of riled up a little bit, you might say. Both the radar at Andrews and the radar at National were picking these blips up, and they would send up chase planes. And the chase planes couldn't catch up with them, even though they weren't at a very high altitude, but they could fly so much faster and better than any plane we had at that time. So that kind of shook up Washington. And the Air Force explanation, of course, was that it was a temperature inversion. And that's what the radar operators were seeing. It was just a temperature inversion, so that's why none of the pilots could catch up with them. Well, the Weather Bureau disagrees that that was not a temperature inversion. And also, the radar people who run the radar said, well, we've seen temperature inversions, we know what they are, and it wasn't a temperature inversion. And the Dr. James McDonnell out of University of Arizona, he was a physicist, primarily dealt with atmospheric physics, so he would certainly know. He also knew a lot about UFOs, by the way. Anyway, he went and investigated and said, well, physically impossible for a temperature inversion to be the cause of that event. But the government was shook up about this. If you look at the date, 1953, some of you might remember that we were kind of in a Cold War with Russia. And in fact, I remember having to do duck and hide practices under my desk in case we had a nuclear exchange. So the tensions were high. And what the fear was that this could be a false flag set up that would clog the phone lines in case we had to actually evacuate or do something like that. So they really wanted it investigated and a response by the scientists as to what we should do. And the CIA, which was fairly young at that time, was commissioned to handle this task. So they commissioned a panel under Dr. Robertson, and they spent almost a year collecting data to investigate this phenomena. And then finally in 1953, they gave their recommendation, and it was to discredit and debunk UFOs and witnesses by using psychiatrists, astronomers, and media to significantly reduce the public interest. And that's kind of what they do today. And that became the official U.S. Air Force policy, which in some extent is still even used today. The unfortunate thing is there had been some serious research going on into the UFO phenomena, and a lot of that was squelched. And the Project Blue Book was downgraded, if you would, and stripped of most of its ability. In fact, if you have studied that Blue Book case and what they reported, you know that they really left a lot of things out. Anyway, so how are we going to stop this? Well, there have been attempts to kind of prevent this disclosure from happening. The astronaut Gordon Cooper actually appeared before the United Nations, and asked for disclosure or to have some serious research done by the different nations, and reported. Well, that didn't happen. And in 2009, at the National Press Club, Dr. Edgar Mitchell, the astronaut, asked the Obama administration to make disclosure, and well, that didn't happen. However, the interesting thing is, here's a document published in 1992 called The Fire Officer's Guide to Disaster Control. And I went to my local fire station when I found out about this, and he said, well, you can get it off the internet. So I did. Anyway, it's interesting because chapter 13 is like reading ufology 101. However, if you try and get a copy of this, it's out of print now. And I'm not saying you couldn't find one. You may have to go to a used booklet place, or maybe Amazon might have it. But it's been replaced, although it was published by Penwell Books, it went out of print, and replaced by disaster planning and control. And William Kramer is still the author, but the other author who had actually written the chapter 13, Charles Bamey, has passed away. So they took chapter 13 out. But Bamey was really into UFOs. He had a tremendous library full of information about ufology. So we knew what he was talking about. But if you do go to chapter 13, at the beginning there's this paragraph that says, in the absence of our knowing whether their visits are friendly, he's talking about UFOs, or hostile, it would not be remiss to give some thoughts to the part that the fire departments might play in the event of an unexpected arrival of UFOs in their communities. So if supposedly they don't exist, why would this be published? Here's a list of things that's covered in chapter 13. The UFO threat, background information, what are they? Classification system, the different shapes, history, organizations, why is there the secrecy about it, UFO hazards, and panic hazards, and personal hazards, like psychological. And then there's this warning at the end, and this is very true, and you'll see after you've listened to my lecture why this is very true. Near approaches of UFOs can be harmful to human beings. Do not stand under a UFO when it's operating. No, that's really, don't do that. Do not touch or attempt to touch a UFO that's landed. They're not hot necessarily, but radiation, that's the main thing. And there have been cases of people who have had radiation sickness after being close to UFOs. In fact, I think one person died. So that is a valid warning.